Okay, so the paper is starting to get kind of wrinkly. It's pretty humid in the garage. It's been a damp week, as well as the water I'm putting on the paper. So I'm gonna stop and press the paper flat again. One of the ways you can avoid this is to tape it down all the way around the edge. So a little bit. I've only got it taped in the corners, so that's not keeping it from wrinkling. So you can do that. You can also get paper that is in a block where it's already taped down around the edges. Okay, sorry about my voice, a little scratchy this week. Anyway, so I'm gonna press this for a few hours and I will come back to it. Okay, I'm back, and I had to let the phone charge a little bit so we could keep going. So I worked a little bit on the dark in the background, particularly for all of you who are not paying much attention to the background. It's arguably one of the most important parts of the painting is the background, because this darkness is what pushes this light forward, right? So if this is light, that, because there's a little bit of value there, that becomes dark, right? So it's a really important thing to establish the values pretty much how you see them. They don't have to be the right colors. Color is flexible. There are a lot of things that are very, very flexible, but getting the values pretty close is a really important job. Also, I want to encourage you to try all of your brushes. So I'm using the mop, the wash brush that you picked up. It's a good idea to try all of your brushes. You know, off and on throughout the term, you'll find that different things can be done. This holds a lot of paint, a lot of water. So if you have a big area, like that big area back there, that you want to work in, that's perfect. It will allow you to take on much kind of bolder marks and more paint. When we watch the demos by our visiting artists, you'll see them using really big, bold brushes. If we were painting face-to-face in class, you would be hearing over and over and over and over me saying, more paint and a bigger brush. Because little tiny brush marks get kind of tedious. They get old pretty fast. It takes forever, you know, where I can load the brush one time, go through, paint a big shape. If you're using tiny brushes, it takes just forever to get that same thing done. Something else that might be kind of happening is, although I'm working warm and cool, and I think that it's a good idea to work in warm and cool, I'm really just using the colors. I'm just using the colors that are available, that were pre-mixed, that were part of my color wheel. I tried that experiment. I'm not sure I got it right, but I tried mixing a little phthalo blue with magenta again, just so I could keep that same temperature of color, that same temperature of blue in it. We'll see how that works. It's looking a little more phthalo this time around, but variety is also pretty exciting. And you can see I'm just mixing a little bit of whatever was in there. I'm not quite sure what it was anymore. I think there was a little bit of a red brown. Yeah, it looks like it. Some residue around the sides. Doesn't really matter. What I'm doing is just trying to get some warm colors and cool colors. If this process is tough for you, what you can do is just convert the image to black and white and stick to a value study. That's fine. It really is. You'll end up with a really interesting painting either way. Okay, so I'm going to pick up on a couple of these big shapes that we didn't take care of yesterday. I think I'm going to need to work into that blue a little bit more. I think the tabletop needs to be much bluer and much darker. So as I make these other shapes darker, I think that's going to show up as an issue. And this isn't really a good shape for this next set of things, so I'm going to set this brush aside. Okay. So this week, as we get into light logic and into some terms regarding form and light logic, I think you're going to find the conversation getting more interesting. Okay. Because light color, when you learn a few terms, they add precision to your conversation. It allows you to ask much more interesting questions. And when you discover the terms around light logic, which are really old. I mean, the whole conversation about light logic is certainly not a new conversation, but it's a really important idea that you be able to describe a form using just a couple of terms. And like if you were walking through a forest with a really good marine or a really good forest biologist. So you were walking through the forest and you had a friend walking with you who isn't just an expert on forestry, knew everything about the woods, could really address all kinds of questions, and could point out like where there was a fire last year or what was going on in the life of the forest over the last few years, just based on the evidence of the kinds of trees and wildflowers, the kinds of things that are going on, because they can see the signs of recovery. They can see the signs of problems in the forest. They can point out things to you like where the forest is hurting, damage that's been done, the evidence of fires that go back decades because it changes the way that the trees grow. I mean, it can be really eye-opening to have an expert walk you through some experience that you've had a million times. And the same is true when you add a new term to your vocabulary. Then what you get is an opportunity to see the world through those expert terms and ask a completely different set of questions. And asking good questions is what leads to having interesting and informed answers. So these terms are really important as a transfer requirement. They're really important because the CSUs and other schools really want you to speak the language of art when you get to their universities. But it's also really important because it gives you the opportunity to ask questions in a much more informed and thoughtful way. One of the nice things about watercolors, as you just saw, is that you can use your fingers. Okay, where else is it? Shadow. Okay, there's a kind of a cool thing going on, warm and cool thing going on in the shadows. So these shadows on the tabletop appear to be much cooler because there was a skylight above them. So in our classroom studio, we have a skylight. So the color of the sky that day, whatever day you're painting, has a huge effect on the way that we're seeing images. So one of the things we have to do in the classroom is pay some attention to that. You saw earlier that that's a diffused edge. So the spotlight falls on that table right in there. So I'm going to mop up that color. So clean, dry brush. So every time I get too much paint in it, I'm just cleaning it on a paper towel. Okay. And you can see what a big difference that made, right? It's by darkening the background, by having value and temperature on the tabletop, things are starting to come together in a completely different way, starting to feel different. And that's part of what you're going for, is that feeling. It's not all a highly scientific process. Okay, let's see. It should be pretty light. Okay, and I'm leaving that little white edge down along that side, but I can clean it up as well while I'm painting. Because having that light is pretty important, and then it falls off just like the shadow does behind it, and this one does. So it's not a really sharp edge. It's sharp on one side and soft on the other. Okay, so let's see. So we got that warm and cool. That is feeling a little gray. We got the tabletop handled. So I'm going to paint the inside of these bags, get those shadows, those smaller shapes handled, because it'll require a little bit of skill. But I'm going to get some coffee. Okay, now I'm caffeinated. That's got to help, right? Okay, so I'm going to continue to use a slightly neutralized blue-gray. It's a little bit cooler than it is. Okay, and those little puddles that form, you can actually direct those a little bit. Certainly while the paper is a little bit flat, you can. So where you want to put a little bit more paint, that's part of the wet on wet process, is I can create a wet area and then drop in the corner of the brush. I can drop some deeper paint into that and it'll diffuse because wet on wet. So it'll diffuse into the area. And you can see how that pushes the image back quite a bit. So it pushes that edge of the bag back in space. So as I take on these kind of shadowy parts of the bags, little details and things, it doesn't mean that I can't have some fun and let the paint just be paint, because that's part of what we're doing here, just letting the paint be paint. Now, I could be reaching for a smaller brush, but more paint, bigger brush isn't just kind of a funny thing to say. It actually solves a lot of problems. That if you paint the details with a slightly larger brush, doesn't mean you're grabbing a house painting brush or something, but it means that as you're going through and looking at things, so while I'm looking at forms, what I want to do is use a tool that'll allow me to communicate that I'm pretty clear on the concept, that I'm pretty clear on what I'm painting. I'm not entirely sure what the psychological mechanism of confidence is, but most people find the competent and clear execution of a task, whether it's in the Olympics or in, just the way that they communicate. Most of us feel like it somehow conveys a certainty, kind of a healthy self-image, but also a clarity on just what we're doing in a different way. So when we're unclear, we have a tendency, like most people, not just Fresmans, but most people have a tendency to kind of change our delivery a little bit. So if we're a little fuzzy on what the goal is, what the intentions are in something, then we're less confident about taking it on. So in art, one of the things that comes across is that if you're pretty clear on what you're doing, it shows. And if you're not clear on what you're doing, it also shows. And as I said, not exactly sure what the mechanism is. Terms like subtext and expression show up in discussions about painting, and I don't know. I don't know exactly where confidence lives in a brushstroke. But a bigger brush, a bolder mark, seems to convey to most people confident execution. It is just kind of part of the way that the mark itself feels. Okay, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm almost done. Look, once those little shapes are nailed down, so I've got this series of shapes, I've got to darken that, a little bit more detail up there. We're rapidly coming to the end of this painting, and I think that's a pretty interesting, pretty cool, right? That we're able to get to this. It's the last couple of marks. They're not a big deal. They're certainly not difficult, but they convey something kind of cool. Also, I don't know if you're noticing, but when I'm painting shapes like edges, I'm not just dragging the brush down, because the odds that I'd get both sides of that mark accurate are kind of slim. And there's, at least for me, I think it's pretty interesting the way that a mark feels. This whole idea of confidence, not confidence. So I think that brush strokes have kind of a personality of their own. And when you make really confident marks, then the work takes on a bit of that confidence. I'm just trying to get some more paint on here. Okay. There we go. Okay, I want to get some shadow down in there. Okay, and my observation is that the shadow is sort of warm at the top where there's light bouncing around. And then as it moves down through the other side of the bag there, so if this is the warm side of the bag, this side of the bag feels a little bit cooler. Okay, kind of a tricky thing I'm going to try to do here. I'm going to try to leave just a little tiny edge. Okay. So you can see this color and that color really similar. So I'm going to warm this up just a little bit. And this would be maybe one argument for not working from a black and white reference, although it's totally up to you. But in this particular case, being able to see where the warm and cool shapes are, because that lost edge would be kind of a big deal later on. Okay, and then I'm going to put in a little bit, as I clean that up, see what I'm doing is I'm using the brush like a printmaking tool. So all I'm doing is getting a clean edge and just tapping the end of the brush on the surface. And this paint is just barely set up. So, so it's not going to have a perfect clean edge, and that's fine. I don't really need a perfect edge. Perfection is overrated. Plus, it's unattainable. Haven't seen a perfect thing. So it'd be kind of useless for me to strive to create something perfect right now. I just want to create something good. And good is not a bad place to start. Okay, so we've got that. This shadow, which is a warmer temperature, and there we go. Okay, so that shadow, I may need to put just a little bit more shadow back there, but I have to wait till that dries. So this does some really interesting things, right? When you put paint into this wet on wet, just like the wet areas last night when I walked away from this to let it dry. So each one of those areas has its own kind of mark flavor. I'm just out of that bar. Like I said, we're getting pretty close to the end here. There's a little bit of a gradation, so the light is less at the top, more at the bottom. Same here, less at the top, more at the bottom. And I'm deciding whether I want to do anything with that or whether I'm happy with the risks that I've taken. And I haven't decided, which is nice. So while the paint is drying, I get to think a little bit. Let's see, I think that's pretty well resolved. That could be, I could maybe darken that up a little bit. So you can see basically I've got two little puddles of gray going here, one that's just warmer gray and one that's cooler gray. So I'm not working anything close to a full palette here yet, but and part of the reason why I think darkening this up just a little bit might help is so that I can be sure to have that light edge. So if something gets a little too much paint on it, you can lift the paint. You can come back afterward and try to lift a little bit of the paint, or you can darken the colors around it, which clearly is not the solution to everything, because at a certain point it just becomes too dark. But it's not a bad strategy for moving through something that's just a little off. Okay, and that transition from warm to cool, not only does it show up in the reference, but it's more interesting, right? So if you paint solid colors, just big chunks of solid colors are a little boring. Having a bit of color change, that's part of the things we looked at, was how to have a gradation from one color to another color, how to do wet on wet, how to make dry marks, how to create controlled edges and less controlled edges. Each one of those things is showing up in this painting. These buried edges, so when I paint almost to the edge of a shape, leave that little bit of blue showing around the side, or a little bit of the initial table gray showing there. Those things where I'm creating a color by having other colors around it. That's the same thing that's going up here, so that the light edge is buried. It's an illusion. There really isn't, there isn't a ton of light there. It looks like I dripped some water on the painting too. All part of the process. So that's pretty close. I'm gonna have to let this dry so that I don't damage it going the last couple of little steps, but I will, but watching paint dry is not nearly as much fun as it sounds. That is in the shadows, so I'm gonna just let it darken a little bit. But I will, you know what, let me demo real quickly and show you. I'm gonna mix up a little bit of a darker value. I picked up a tiny bit of Payne's Gray. Payne's Gray gets overused, I'm told. Every painting community has its do's and don'ts. I'm told that that right now it's not as cool to use Payne's Gray for everything, which I got to agree. It's not cool to use anything all the time. But those little occlusions, those little tiny shadows that just rest at the bottom of a shape, so where that paper meets the tabletop, just those little tiny indications, they can be really powerful. It can have just a huge effect on making it feel like that object is resting on the table. And without it, it feels very flat. It can feel very, very flat. So I'm going to darken that color in order to push that bag in the back. And I've got to let that dry to create the occlusion. But I'm pretty close. So I'm going to turn off the camera, let this dry, finish it up, and then I will post the video to the class. Okay? I'll be sure to include an image of the final so that you can see kind of what the last couple of moves were. All right, well, have fun with this. You can see it took more than an hour to do this. I was working pretty quickly and did take a few shortcuts, but you saw how much time it took me to get going. The first couple of marks are very important. Probably spent 5 or 10 minutes just getting the first bag in place, and I'm still not 100% sure that that's not too wide. I think it may be just a little too wide, but those are the kinds of things you want to check. If something feels off, trust yourself, it's probably off. Okay, so that's it for right now, and we'll talk in a little bit.